Ready? All right. I'll call this meeting to order. Good evening. Welcome to the City of Montpelier Development Review Board. My name is Daniel Richardson. I serve as chair for this meeting Monday, September 16th, 2019. The other members from my right are
Rob Goodwin.
Michael Lazorchak.
Meredith Crandall, staff. Kate McCarthy.
Ryan Kane.
Claire Rock.
All right, the first order of business is approval of the agenda. We have one application before us tonight. Are there any additions or changes to the agenda? Hearing none, I will accept a motion to accept the agenda as drafted.
So moved.
Motion by Ryan. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Rob. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. We have an agenda. There are no comments from the chair this evening. The next item of business is the minutes from September 3rd. Myself, Kate, Rob, Michael were in 1, 2, 3, 4. We have just enough to approve the minutes. Do I have any additions, changes to the minutes? If not, I'll take a motion to accept the minutes of September 3rd.
Motion to approve the minutes as drafted.
Okay, motion by Rob. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Kate. All those in favor, please raise your right hand that are eligible to vote. And we have minutes for September the 3rd. Very exciting. First item of business is, and only item of business, is 260 Elm Street. If the applicant will step forward to the table. Hi.
I'd say just make sure you hold the microphone close and speak pretty closely into it.
So the way in which we do this, I'll have you introduce yourself, and then I'll put you under oath, and then I think it would be helpful in this particular situation for Meredith to start off, because you're here for a very particular reason, and she can help frame it. And then I'll turn the floor over to you to add any additional information that you think we should consider during our review. Okay, so if you'll state your name for the record.
Sure. My name is Sarah Hoffmeyer, and I'm a local landscaper in Montpelier. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And you're the owner of this property at?
I'm not the owner.
Oh, you're just the
but
landscaper.
I'm the landscape designer for the
Okay.
project. Yeah.
All right. If you'll raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the evidence you're about to give for the matter under consideration shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under pains and penalties of perjury?
I do.
Right. So, Meredith, you want to tee this up?
Yeah, so the reason this is before the DRB is because the applicant wants to put up a 6-foot high fence along the Elm Street frontage. Typically fences would just be an administrative approval, especially for a single-family home, but the general allowance for front yard fences is only 4.5 feet. So they need to ask for a waiver. The extra complication is that the way I interpret the waiver provision, fence heights are allowed no more than a 10% waiver, which here would, out of 4.5 feet, would bring you up to 5 feet, roughly. And they're asking for a 6-foot. So in addition to a waiver that has to go to the DRB, you've also got the asking for a waiver greater than what is supposed to be allowed. We've run into this before, but not with fences. So it's something to pick through the particulars of.
Okay. And so my understanding is also this is covered by this, in specific, the bylaw concerning fence heights.
Right. So you have the height waiver maximums in 3002. Right? Is that the one? Yeah. But then you also have the fences and walls provision in section 3101D.
And that's where we start, where it talks
Yeah.
about the front yard. Fences or walls located within a front yard shall not exceed a height of 4.5 feet.
Microphone's on the other side of you.
I know. I I thought I was projecting. Is that, you picking it up, Rob?
It's helping now.
Okay. So, okay,
You gotta just lean the other way.
I understand. We're not only performing for ourselves, but for the greater audience of Montpelier. So, the 3101D says front yard, and says fences or walls located within a front yard shall not exceed a height of 4.5 feet, and the applicant shall demonstrate that the fence will not interfere with line of sight or of pedestrians, bicycles, or vehicles in the right of way.
Right.
And then, there is a definition as well of.
Yeah, sorry,
of
I was teeing it up and summarizing,
Yeah,
not getting into.
no,
the
no, I
nitty-gritty.
understand, I just
Okay.
wanna, I'm not gonna read that definition, but I just want us to sort of start from all the same
Okay.
chapter and verse. So, you know, before we get to the, and I'll get to some of the nuance in a second, so, if you wanna add to that at this point, as to, and in particular, I think it would be helpful to understand what are the issues driving this need for a waiver, and a heightened fence?
Sure.
What are the contours of the project?
Yeah.
So,
When I first started working with West and Allison, it was back in 2017. So it's a long project, but that's partially my fault as a designer. I do try to slow people down when it comes to landscapes. But so at that time, they were still, West had a pretty good idea of what the building renovations were going to be at that point, but he wanted more information on how that relates to the landscape. And so the first time I met with him was in October of 2017. And I go through site analysis as part of what I do when coming up with designs. And because of the transition between a public space and a private space, sight lines were really important. And so we looked, at that time, the hedge for the Meadow Mart was still fully functional. The deer have now since eaten it. But on the Vine Street, or on the Elm Street side, there was an invasive hedge and then kind of just shrub plants. And so we knew we had to address that. But we looked a lot at the sight lines. So coming from Birch Grove was the main driving force behind a fence. Actually, West wanted to put in a vegetative hedge, and I talked him out of it and went instead with a fence so that he could have year-round, just that little buffer, not just from sight lines, but also we looked at noise and then also dust, believe it or not. So I looked at the dust line in the spring, and inches do make a difference. That's, I think, why we're here, why West, Allison, and myself felt it was important to get the extra inches. Because for the sight lines, people sitting at Birch Grove, looking into the property, for solar gain, they wanted to put a sunroom on that one side, on the southwest. It used to be a porch, and now it'll be a sunroom. And that's a great spot. I mean, it's got great solar gain. It makes sense. But unfortunately, it's in direct view when you take down all the vegetation for the people at Birch Grove who are sitting having coffee to look in. And so we talked about options. We looked at them all. And it's not just a privacy fence. The top 12 inches would be lattice. Something else we talked about were interrupted views. So they have in the design, it was to have a gate. And that is, across from nothing where people would be sitting looking right in. That's a movement area. But where there is sitting and looking, staring, is from Birch Grove. And so that's where the fence, 6 feet really made sense, even with having the lattice in the top part. So that was kind of the main driver of that. Softening the fence too, they didn't, if you see on the Vine Street side, they have a 4-foot picket fence. So it's not about closing themselves off at all. It was about controlling views into the property as well as controlling views out, but softening the fence by pulling it back the 30 inches from the sidewalk so that perennials can grow in vines, but then also softening the top part. So already in the design were to have trellises abutting the fence as part of the fence. And that was so that it wasn't just this, really stark looking built thing, that it was really kind of part of it. Yeah.
Okay. So it sounds as if there's a number of issues that are driving this need for this fence: privacy, sightlines, dust, noise control.
Yeah.
And can you explain, from a noise perspective, is the extra, assuming for a moment this is the front yard, and assuming for a moment 4.5 feet
Yeah.
is what we're working off of,
Mhm.
to what extent are these additional, 3.5 feet necessary for noise purposes, or to prevent noise from entering?
Yeah.
1.5
One-
feet.
Well, sorry, 1.5
Yeah.
feet.
And here's where this is out of my expertise range, but I do know, so most noise is generated actually from tires.
Mhm.
So it's truly the bottom 20 inches. If any of you are having problems with noise, you need to block the tires of anything. But that corridor of Elm Street, noise bounces off buildings. And so that's where I haven't done a noise analysis, but I know whatever you're getting up above that, you're helping to just soften it. And one of the main purposes of the fence too is to hold greenery in the growing season. But when everything's dying back, that's when noise can really, it's in the stick seasons. It's the mud season, fall, when things are dying back, but people aren't inside with closed windows yet. And that's what the fence really serves that purpose.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's just extra inches, so I think, I couldn't tell you how much noise it's gonna help, but I know it'll soften it just a little bit more. And the Vine Street side, I mean, you can see they're not even worried about that because people are slowing to a stop.
Right.
It's that if there's no one in the pedestrian crosswalk, people are going 25 miles an hour, sometimes more.
So you mentioned before that this porch on the Elm Street side is now being closed in.
Right,
So will there be an entrance or exit off of that porch, or,
yes.
okay,
Yeah, there will be a door on that side, and then it leads to a gate. And the Elm Street side is considered their secondary entrance. You just reminded me of another point. So to give the landscape cue that isn't their primary entrance, they wanted it to be a little less welcoming than the Vine Street side. That's why the Vine Street side has lower fencing and the picket fence, so that it's much more welcoming. It's like, come in, whereas they want, just people that really aren't familiar with them, that wouldn't know.
right.
That's all of New England. I never know which door to go to. I don't know if you guys feel that way. It's like, what door do I go to? So we're trying to make it a little bit more obvious.
Okay, and the Vine Street side is where their garage is, where their cars will be coming in and out. It's where
Right.
their front door is going to be.
Right, the main entrance.
For the main entrance of the house.
That's true.
Okay,
But it's still open on the Elm Street side, and the design had an arbor going over that, but it's a little less open than the Vine Street side.
right. But I'm trying to, I just want to make, and I think you've made it clear, is just that, this is going from a front porch
Yeah.
to a sunroom and a side entrance that by design and intent will be a private side entrance,
Yes.
as opposed to the primary frontage
Right.
facing the street, which is historically, at least the way this house is situated, there is a good argument that visitors, strangers, male people, friends would have used this front porch entrance as they do on any of these other houses up and down Elm Street, because
Yeah.
that's the front facing, and they're shifting, the owners are shifting this so that now the door on Vine Street becomes the primary entrance, and all cues will lead
To the Vine Street
to
side.
the Vine Street side.
True. I'd have a little pushback on it in that many of the houses are renting or have tenants. And so entrances, I've noticed on a lot of the buildings, are really different or have additional entrances that I wouldn't say are traditional.
Sure, I mean, obviously,
thi-
when you deal
this
with
used to
rental
be a rental,
properties.
yeah.
But when you look at the, and that's a fair point, I'm not,
Yeah. And this used to be a rental. Allison lived in it for, she's one of the owners, Allison and West. She rented for, I think, 4 or 5 years before buying it. And she never used the front, the Elm Street side. It was always the Vine Street side. So we kind of kept with that.
Okay, so,
Yeah.
go ahead.
This is a really interesting discussion about the role of different entrances, and
Yeah.
I'm actually interested. Even though sometimes those front formalized entrances don't get used, they still have a role to play in terms of the cohesiveness of the street and
That's true.
sort of the way the houses side by side along that street interact with each other and create the neighborhood character.
Yeah.
So as I've looked at this house, and I walk by it pretty frequently because of where I live, it really is oriented to Elm Street. Its address is Elm Street. So one thing to think about is, as we consider how this does or doesn't change the character, is the way it changes the relationship with the street. Even though functionally, the
Yeah.
front entrance, the primary entrance will be off of Vine Street, and all of the functionality that you've described is extremely thoughtful. But as far as its within the overall context, what would this decision do to that
Yeah,
relation?
And going back to in recent years, it had a 6 to 15-foot invasive hedge. Allison told me a story just last week that it used to be called the Witch's House when she rented there. I don't know if any of you, I mean, I lived in the meadow, I didn't know it was called the Witch's House, but it's because it had a pretty, what's the word? It kept people kind of having that feeling when you walk past it, and it's unkempt and overgrown. Of at Halloween, don't go in there. It's a Gothic style house. But so I think it was never welcoming as on the Elm Street side.
Right.
And consciously through this design of a fence that has an interrupted lattice view for all walkers to be able to see in, and then a welcoming gate, that it is actually more welcoming than what it was the past decade, I would think. But I do fully understand keeping the character. It's a historic home. A 6-foot high fence wouldn't have been there when this house was built. That wouldn't have been in character with the times. But I do think one other quick point is Allison and West are really conscientious people and very much concerned with how people are feeling about their property. And I think when we took down the invasive hedge, they were really concerned that people were like, what are you doing? You're removing vegetation. And so they made sure that I was on site and my husband Alex, who's working on the property, were on site when that happened to explain to people, just to educate that this actually was a really bad hedge. It's invasive. It's not something you should plant. And that came from Allison, that she really wanted to make sure people weren't worried.
I think just as far as the front, which is the front entrance, which is the front yard, is not really, the definition is actually defined
Right.
that on corner lots, where you front on both streets, you have 2 front yards. So regardless of which is the primary entrance or which was historically the primary entrance, I think the regulations are pretty clear that the front yard specific regulations apply both to Vine and Elm Street.
I agree.
Yeah.
So.
I
Yeah.
agree. I guess my remarks were more about the character evaluation than where the different heights applied, but that's a good clarification, given that this is a corner lot and has that special definition.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with your reading of the definition. One thing, and I should say, at the same time, this is clearly intended in some ways to denote a primary yard that is located between the street and the nearest line of principal building on the lot. It's the idea that it is the frontage, the primary entrance. But the way this is defined, I don't think there's wiggle room for us. to declare one to be the front yard and the other a side yard, because it is a corner lot.
Yeah.
I'll add to that, that the way the fences and walls are drafted, that there is no exception for the front yard 4.5-foot fence under 3101D. You know, it says fences or walls located within a front yard shall not exceed a height of 4.5 feet, and the applicant shall demonstrate that the fence will not interfere with line of sight of pedestrians, bicycles, or vehicles in the right-of-way. It's 3101E for side and rear yard that says they can go higher if there are certain conditions that allow or require the height to be a little bit higher. And so I don't read 3101D as allowing those same analyses to apply.
About allowing any waiver?
No, but just as, so I read 3101E
Yep.
as creating its own, so if you read 101E, it says that it shall be 6 feet except one, where higher fence is approved by the DRB or required under these regulations for buffer screening or security purposes.
Right, that's not where I got the waiver allowance.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
I'm not talking about the waiver.
Okay,
So
great,
I'm just saying that,
perfect.
that in and of itself, it has its own standards to allow that, and so we're not talking about that. So that does force us to go then.
And the fact that the planning commission included specific authorization for the DRB to raise the height of fences in a side yard.
Side or rear,
Certainly
yeah.
indicates that they did not intend that we have that discretion with regard to a front yard beyond the general waiver that we're allowed, which is 10% of any of the dimensional standards within the regulations, which clearly this is a dimensional standard, and so our general waiver authority is available, but again, very clearly capped at 10%, so
Yeah.
I think the only way we get above that is through a variance, and I think as the staff report that sets out, I don't think anybody could say that this would prohibit your beneficial use of the property if you were limited to a 5-foot fence as opposed to a 6-foot fence.
Does it make any difference that the design started before any of these zoning regulations came into play?
It does not. What matters is the date on which the application was filed,
Okay,
so
yeah,
that's the triggering point.
yeah. And does it make any difference that I was the one that came before the zoning board in 2017 to change the fence regulations? And it was this property. I worked with Sarah McShane on it. It doesn't. It came back to bite me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is a really poorly
What-
structured regulation.
What's
so.
interesting too, and this, oh yeah, it is. One thing that West and I talked about, because aesthetics are ultimately what we would like to be considered. There are ways around it which aren't as great as this. The trellising, and so a trellis could go up to 10 feet, and that could be, I don't think there's a setback from what I read, that it could be right up against the fence.
So you'd build a fence and then lean a
And then
trellis
have
against it from the
you could have a
inside.
10-foot trellis, but it just wouldn't be as aesthetically pleasing. And then the other catch, if it's rhetoric, was that this fence was already designed to hold vegetation. And I think, at least in my line of work, the difference between a fence and a trellis is a trellis holds vegetation. And there were already vines designed in it, already parts of the fence that he custom designed to hold vines. And so I could argue if we planted a vine such that it was covered in vines, it would be one big trellis, not one big fence. The rhetoric, and again, that's just me picking it apart. That's not to say that we would do that. That would be ridiculous and it would look silly. But I do think that this option looks better than some of the things, the creative solutions that we've already talked about of what we would do to figure out how to block the sight lines. And I wonder too about that latticing, the interrupted view on the front, if that, I mean, it's latticing, so if that's, you could discount that as part of the fence, even though it's connected. These are just little details that
So,
I don't know if it makes a difference, but we've talked about it. So it's 12 inches of latticing, which takes it down to 5 feet of privacy fencing. Those 5 feet will be holding vegetation year-round. There will be vines that stay woody. So could you count that as trellising in those places?
I'd probably be disinclined to do that because the function is so explicitly fencing, and
Mm.
I chewed
Yeah.
on it before this meeting, and I looked up trellis.
Yeah.
And I looked for pictures, and a framework or light wooden or metal-based
Yeah.
bars, chiefly used as a support for fruit trees or climbing plants. I really think it is intended as something different. And there's a spot in the regulations that talks about things that apply to fences versus things that apply to trellises, arbors, and pergolas.
Yeah.
The fact that those are separated makes me think we're supposed to think of them as different
Those different
functions.
things. Mhm. Yeah, and Middlebury Fence Company is installing it. We don't really install trellises as much.
I mean, that's also, I think, at the end of the day, what we're here to review is a fence application.
Sure.
If we ultimately say, you know, something less than 6 feet, what you do from that with your interpretation of the regulations is up to you. If you
Yeah.
believe you wanna, if there's leniency around trellises, I don't think we can offer an opinion on that, because really all we're asked today is, will we approve a 6-foot tall fence?
Oh, sure.
So, but it's good to think
Yeah.
through what the options might be.
Yeah, and really, we have played around with different options.
That's very
And the
clear
whole
that
reason why
this
we
is-
went through this process was, this is the most attractive. Yeah.
Just a question about, so we're just talking about the height. Ordinarily, if this was proposed to be a 4.5-foot tall fence, you would make a determination that the sight lines were not adversely impacted under 3101D.
And if it was a 4.5, now I'm just like, if it was 4.5 feet tall, am I even looking at the sightlines? Yeah, I mean, that's what for me, if this were 4.5 feet tall, I would do what I did here, which is go to Department of Public Works and get their opinion on the sightlines. And they are comfortable with the sightlines. They're from my world, they're the experts on that. And because they didn't have any concerns, I would have checked off on that, and it would have been administratively approved if it was 4.5 feet tall.
Right. Seems like
Yeah.
we might have to decide tonight whether sightlines would be impacted.
I mean, ultimately, you need to decide that now because the
Yeah.
whole thing comes to you,
Mhm.
Right.
but,
So, I think that's right, Rob, is that the way the ordinance is written, you have a limitation on 4.5 feet, and you have the obligation, so that even if a 4.5-foot fence was proposed, but it created some type of line of sight for pedestrians, bicycles, or vehicles, in the right of way, that would cause us not to grant the permit for even a 4.5-foot fence. And so if I'm understanding this interfere with the line of sight for pedestrians, bicycles, or vehicles, this is really something where, does someone stopping at the intersection or turning at the intersection, is their sightline affected by?
or people walking.
Or people
And
walking.
then having to look around the corner to see if somebody's coming the other way.
And I think we received a determination from the Department of Public Works that even for the 6-foot proposal, sightlines would not be adversely impacted, so.
Right.
Okay. I didn't see that, I guess.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's at the very back, it's an email from Kurt.
Last page.
that
It's also in the
says-
staff report on page 6.
All right. Thank you.
Snuck right in there.
And on the corner, the fence actually goes back 8 feet from the corner, so that there's plenty of room for sightlines.
And
Yeah,
there
that
you
was
stepped it down
considered.
to 5 feet
And
as
it's
well.
stepped down, yeah,
Great.
yeah.
Okay.
As far as the kind of aesthetic cues that the Vine Street entrance, it's still, even if it were 5 feet instead of 6 feet, you'd still propose the difference in fencing, the kind of only obstructed view on Vine Street, and still 4 feet. So, would that still provide those cues even if the fence was capped at 5 feet along Elm Street?
It would to a certain extent, but again, the sightline from Birch Grove in, it's amazing what 6 inches even can do. And the traffic and the dust, it was those things that really, they felt like 4.5 wasn't enough protection. The space between the sunroom area and the edge of the sidewalk is roughly 22 feet, 23 feet. And then when you take into account, not planting things right up against buildings and having a walkway, it really is a tighter space. And so I think that too was why I talked West out of the vegetative hedge and to get in a fence, because it would just, and without even going the whole way up to the sidewalk, having that setback, but to help maximize that front area, just because space was pretty tight. Yeah, and they,
Is it okay if I ask a question? So, if you had a hedge there instead of a fence, what would be the impact on actual use of the sunroom? I mean, if you're talking,
Yeah.
6-foot-high hedge, you're not gonna get that lattice work at the top to let in light necessarily in the summer or the winter. Is that?
the sun might not have as much of an effect. It's more of how that public to private transition space would be, and people walking by, I think people are just naturally curious and want to see. That's why we left like the latticing in the top of the fence, was so you could have these peeks in, because what they're designing in their backyard is incredible. It's going to be really beautiful. And so I think they want people to have these little peeks in while not opening it up, fully for people to feel like they can just kind of reach a hand over or walk in. Not so welcoming, but it's like, yes, come. So they were really conscious about that. I think the main problem with hedges is the upkeep.
Yeah.
The maintenance. I know the tree board was pruning that hedge years ago on that same property. Deer, we saw this year that the deer pressure is unreal, and so I think we have to reassess, and this goes further into policy, but reassess using vegetative hedges. I think we have a lot of factors coming in with pests and diseases that are really unusual, and they're happening faster every year. So I did talk him out of that, but we're still using vegetation intentionally in different areas so that you get these little views in, but then there's these blocks of privacy. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So, do we all agree that we're talking about a 10% waiver under 3002J? That
Well, this is, I mean, it's an interesting question, because I think the applicant needs to agree that that's what the applicant is seeking, you know what I mean? If the application is, we'd like a 6-foot fence, and I think we're in agreement that we don't have any discretion to grant a 6-foot fence under the regulations.
right.
Unless we wanna toss them out the window and but and we've done that, to be clear. There have been other provisions where we've gone beyond that 10%, but there have been strongly compelling reasons to do so.
Sure.
What I'm hearing you say is that the higher the better. We're trying to but every inch helps in minimizing the impacts of noise, dust, and views from Birch Grove.
Below 6 feet, to be clear, we would not have
Sure.
gone above 6, even if there was a 8-foot-high maximum.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wouldn't fit.
But between
Right.
anything above inches above 4.5, maxed out at 6,
Yeah,
help.
that's it.
But I don't know that for me personally is as compelling a reason to deviate so clearly from the regulations. Again, and those other situations too. I mean, I think it is important, the fact that the regulations do say, hey, DRB, look at side yards, you can go bigger, and don't say that for front yards. I think
Right.
it indicates a conscious choice on behalf of the planning commission to say, we do not want the DRB having the authority to, go beyond that. And so I'd be very hesitant to do that. But so back to my point is, I think if the application is, we would like a 6-foot fence, I don't think we can say, well, we'll give you a 5-foot fence. I think we say either yes or no, you can have a 6-foot fence, unless the applicant here is saying, reading the tea leaves, we'd like a 5-foot fence, and then at that point, I would be happy.
Well, I mean, I understood our review to be conducted in part and testimony in part to be geared towards the idea of a waiver. You know, they're asking for a 6-foot fence, but they have filled out the waiver or variance
Okay,
application, so.
I guess that's probably sufficient then, I don't know, I just wanted to flag it to make sure that we're not going beyond our role as reviewing what's before us and
I
getting
think,
into designing a project.
I mean, at least the way our, you know, waiver and variance forms are developed and the way an application like this reads out, you know, they're applying for a zoning permit for a 6-foot fence, and then recognizing that they would need a actually, it's not a waiver, you're asking for a variance, if I'm, now that I look a little closer.
I've analyzed it under both.
But the analysis is gone and the testimony's gone under both. You know, and the way the form reads is it's very similar. You know, a variance just carries additional elements so that if you analyze it under a variance, you also get most of the waiver categories. So I don't think we're beyond what's permissible, given the posture of the application.
Can I ask one quick question? It was about the term hardship and how it was stated for the applicant. But going back to the public, people sitting at Birch Grove looking in, is it considered a hardship on them to look directly into someone's private area and have that be something that maybe should be avoided for the sake of the commercial business?
No.
No, okay, no.
That's an
Deal with
interesting
it,
question.
wear your underwear.
That was great.
Okay.
No, that's a good
Yeah.
question.
Yeah,
I
Claire.
was there was a note in here, previous application for a porch, and I believe there was a waiver that was granted that exceeded the stated allowance. And I think it's worth maybe just considering that application and some of the kind of decision-making that went into that and how that would potentially apply to a situation like this, just to make sure that the decisions we're making are kind of in alignment.
Sure.
Are you talking about the North Franklin Street or the Franklin Street
Yes.
application?
Yes.
Well, the difference in the North Franklin Street application was, one, we were dealing with a different set of ordinances. So as Ryan pointed out, we didn't have clear language that was allowing for certain waivers on one side and not allowing it on others. We didn't have that clear policy statement from the Planning Commission in the drafting of this ordinance. The second was, you had clear evidence that this was a house that was largely situated by accident of its design and the width of the right-of-way in an area where the variance or the waiver was rendered somewhat meaningless because of just the function of this extensive right-of-way, notwithstanding the fact that, you know, if you measured from the sidewalk and yard, it would have had a deeper porch allowed. And third, I think on top of all that, you also had clear evidence that every other house up and down this road was well within this right-of-way. And then fourth, you had DPW also saying, we don't have a problem with this whatsoever. It doesn't affect any of the city-held rights of way. So, you know, given that, those pieces of evidence, you know, I think those are all distinguishable than the situation here, except, of course, the DPW signed off and said we're okay with that. But, you know, here you have you have an ordinance that has stated some policy about what's allowed for extensions, and granting some to side and rear, but very specifically not to front. You don't have evidence that this is a common problem up and down the street. In fact, the testimonies notwithstanding the fact that, there's a lot of secondary entrances, a lot of these fronts along Elm Street have been preserved. And then, you don't have this sort of but-for situation of the funkiness of the lot. This is just a corner lot problem. So I think all of those distinguish and are probably what are leading at least me and others to
Right,
say
those differences between these two
it's
situations.
not a compelling, it's not the compelling case that the Franklin Street was, that the waiver was, otherwise rendered meaningless if we didn't extend it slightly.
And I think to the point of privacy, I mean, the whole idea of a front yard is that it's, you're gonna have views from a frontage into a residence.
Yeah.
Especially when the maximum height that you're allowed to have a fence is only 4.5 feet. I mean, I think that we have to assume
Yeah.
that was taken into an account, and
Yeah.
the fact that there's a very popular bakery with absolutely delicious baked goods across the street, I mean, that's part of downtown Montpelier.
It is.
So I don't, and there aren't any other 6-foot fences along the frontage of Elm
Yeah.
Street.
And
They're all rentals, though. That's
Yeah.
the thing that I don't get called in on rental properties very often because people don't invest into landscapes. And so that's the big difference, that this is a unique area or a unique property in that they're investing in their landscape, and you look all along the street and it truly is a lot of rentals
Yeah,
that haven't been. So it's unique in that sense.
but, notwithstanding my earlier editorializing, I mean, the planning commission has said, we want clear views and sightlines along the front of properties.
Yeah.
And we want that to extend along the front, not just front,
Right.
but one front, but if it's a corner lot, along
Yeah.
the total frontage. So, I mean,
Right.
if we had a different set of, this is where, the language of the bylaws do matter. If we
Yeah.
had different language, if we had, some of these elements, we could certainly weigh those. We're sort of talking about an extreme situation that was off, what I would consider sort of off the norm with that Franklin Street property. But here, we have a pretty clear decision by the planning commission to make that.
Sure.
And so, you can argue and you can say, well, that's a good idea or a bad idea.
Oh, yeah.
But at the end of the day, it is what they've adopted. And
Yeah.
so for us to impose or put a thumb on the scale on this, in this respect, goes against not just sort of, well, this is probably a gray area, but the clear intent. I mean, it's not a gray area. You can argue that it would make sense, that it would
Yeah.
make a beautiful project. I mean, clearly a lot of time and effort has gone into it, but it is,
Right.
we're left with a bylaw that,
Sure.
that doesn't, that talks about side and rear, having more, but very clearly leaving front to be left low.
Yeah, I think, just stepping back at the bigger picture, what's a bummer is that you have these properties adjacent in this property too, that had unruly, way bigger, way thicker privacy hedges. And they have removed that with the intent of doing something better and more beautiful. And to have that disapproved of is kind of like, wow, we should have just left the hedge. It's not a motivation to other people to do this, which is kind of a bummer. I mean, you see that burning bush hedge that's 2 doors down, and it's huge, and it's an invasive species that
Right.
is, doing all these bad things. And they might say, well, we shouldn't take it down because then we only get 4.5 feet. Why would we do that?
Right.
And
4.5 feet of
instead,
fencing, I mean, that's part of it too. 'cause
Fencing.
We're stuck with the regulations that we're stuck with.
Oh,
and
yeah,
it's
I
like-
totally get
But I
it.
think, to the extent that there's no limits on the size of plantings that you wanna plant or hedges, then
yeah,
Well-
you're left with those options. I mean, but
And-
at the end of the day, it's,
right.
the regulations have said, if you're gonna have a fence, as opposed to vegetation or trellis or lattice or whatever else, if you're gonna have a
Yeah.
fence in your front yard, it's only up to 4.5 feet. And then we also have this general provision, we're allowed to extend
Yeah.
dimensional things 10%, but that's, I mean,
Yeah.
we can't, there's.
No, I get it.
Yeah.
I do. It
And-
just,
and I
it's
think your
the bigger
argument-
picture.
Sure.
I think that is, and the vice chair does not like it when I say this, but when, that's a great argument to make to the planning commission about this bylaw, because
Tried to 2 years ago.
here's a situation where, and if they vote, if it was made and they didn't accept it, then clearly they felt other compelling reasons controlled, but, that's the board that can really make those type of changes. We can't impose those. I mean, our flexibility comes where, there's a clear intent by an ordinance that's not met by a particular factual circumstance, as opposed to here where the intent is crystal clear and,
Just doesn't make sense. In these
Y- y-
circumstances, it doesn't.
well,
make
or
sense.
it makes it,
I mean,
It
that-
does with the site. I mean,
If-
if you analyze the property, it does make sense.
Mhm.
I totally
Sure.
get why rules exist.
Yeah.
I see landscaping companies not following rules all the time, and it drives me bananas.
Bet. I
So,
bet. Yeah.
as one of the landscaping companies that's trying to do the right thing,
Mhm.
I do see the you have to have rules. You have to, and it does. I mean, all of the rules that I've used and followed, I feel like yes, they're there for that reason. This property happens to be one that 18 inches, it's 18 inches.
Yeah.
And it does make a difference. And I get it though.
Yeah,
That
I'm
when
not-
you don't have the space to budge, but,
I'm not unsympathetic to your
thanks.
plea.
You've made it well, and your designs are very thoughtful.
No, that's okay, and we have creative solutions around it, so, it was just to present it and to say, I hope that if things like this come up, that, you do hear people out, because smart design is really important, and a lot of people don't do it. A lot of people skip a lot of steps, and so the fact that you're hearing us out at least is nice.
Yeah, no,
But
and
yeah,
if there
we'll
were,
have creative solutions.
again, we're, unfortunately, we're bound to this, but yeah,
I get it, yeah.
we are a quasi-adjudicative board in the sense that, we're not a formal court. And we can hear these things to the greatest extent possible and try, and we are empowered to implement the purposes of these to the extent that we can to get at the sense of it. But, a case like this where there's a policy decision that was made that's baked in like this, unfortunately, that
Yeah.
ties our hands as to what direction. And,
That's okay.
and we have to be careful. And so, that said, would you want us to go forward with a variance, or sorry, so
Yeah.
essentially, there's two choices. There's a waiver and a variance, and I think the board's sort of weather report was that a variance is probably unlikely
Okay.
because they're designed not to be granted. They're really for absolute hardships where, you have the undersized parcel and you can't otherwise do what you would be allowed to do without this little adjustment. So that would put us in the land of waiver. And waiver is great because its standards are much lower. And as you can see, from the application, it really talks about that it does not alter the essential character of the neighborhood or district in which a property is located, substantially or permanently impair the lawful use or development of the adjacent property, reduce access to renewable energy resources, or be detrimental to public welfare. And then that the proposed land development is beneficial or necessary for the continued reasonable use of property. Those are the standards. And so, but it comes with this cap of we can only go 10% up. So basically taking it from 4.5 feet to 6 feet. 5 feet.
We'll take it if it's
Yeah,
six.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
We'll take it.
Yeah, yeah. Wishful thinking.
Keep
But,
in mind, 10% and then 10%.
You know,
How
we
many
can-
waivers would we have to grant?
Yeah.
You know, just-
Could I come back and apply again? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, you get another waiver
Ah.
for the
Right, a
capper
waiver on a
to it.
waiver.
Yeah, no.
um,
That's like Achilles and the tortoise. You'd never get to a finish line.
That's right. It would be infinite.
One of Zeno's paradoxes.
I think
yeah.
I would.
So, that said, we can go that direction. We can also go further discussion on the variance if you feel that that's,
No, I think you've made your case that yeah, it sounds
Well,
like it's.
we don't have to make the case, but if,
You've laid it out for me in a way that isn't optimistic, but,
we've barred that
I-
entrance or made it less inviting
made it
as a
less
primary.
welcoming. It's less welcoming.
Yes.
Secondary entrance. I'd have to talk to West and see if he wanted, and Allison, to see if they wanted to do a waiver. We do have some backup plans, so I could see if they wanted to skip that and just go with a 4.5-foot high fence, but then, we did talk about berms and trellising and arbors, and so.
Well,
there's a lot
that's
of
an
other
interesting
things.
question. 'Cause
To
if-
create a 18-inch berm that then has a 6-foot fence on it, or has a 4.5-foot fence on it. Yes, we have talked
Don't
about
give
it.
away- don't give-
How do you measure?
We've
the
already
height of a
talked about it.
fence?
Yeah, that is language that is silent.
Uh-huh.
So that
Again.
raises an interesting question.
We have talked about that.
So what I would suggest is one way we can do this, if you feel you've sort of exceeded your authority
I don't have authority.
to go any further from your client, we can continue this for 2 weeks. What's our next meeting look like?
The next meeting, depending on what happens between now and 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, could be pretty full.
Well, what I'll say is if we approve a waiver up to 10% and authorize you to build a 5-foot fence, you could still build a 4-foot fence.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, if
Mhm.
the 5-foot fence, the waiver for the 5-foot fence would probably be pretty limited to this particular design and just shrinking it down to 5 feet.
Yeah.
If you came back with a very different design,
Mm,
it would probably have to be limited to the 4.5 feet,
right.
if I was gonna approve that administratively. But you would have the approval of a 5-foot fence under this application, but a
Okay.
different design, it would probably be a separate application.
Yeah.
Right.
So you
Or-
have some options.
Or
Yeah,
the
that
con-
makes sense.
Go
Just
ahead.
to be really clear and make sure we all agree on this, even if you came back with a different design, that 5-foot would probably remain the upper limit. So it really,
Right.
I
You think
think
even with a different design,
the 5-foot would remain the upper limit
Right.
I wouldn't,
because our variance, or our waiver authority is 10% regardless of the design.
right, I'm just saying if she changed the design, if the design is changed so dramatically that it's like a different application where I have to get new Department of Public Works review, isn't that really a new application that they have to get a new waiver on?
Sure.
Yes, but if it's if it's an application for a 5.5
she's
Yes,
just
foot
okay, you're
saying-
just
Oh,
saying
yeah.
they still have to come and get, right, sorry,
Yeah.
did I say 5 foot
I'm
instead
just
of
saying
4.5
it's-
foot?
I think so, yeah, I think we're just saying it's 5
Yeah.
foot no matter what, it's, that
Yeah.
I'm just letting
Yeah,
Yes, that makes
you
sense.
get transparent
Although
that
that-
it's not the design.
Yeah.
I mean, that said, and I'm only one board member, but I think, the compelling reasons for the waiver, apart from a radical design to this, but another thoughtful plan, there's nothing I see on this site that would prevent at least the board from considering this another design in the same way under the waiver criteria. In other words, it's not the fence itself but we would have to conduct that review. This is also a question of, you have a number of different things. I mean, we can continue this, which is, what's nice about that is you don't have to necessarily reapply or rewarn, or, it just is continued to a date certain. And maybe it's not 2 weeks, maybe it's a month from now. And during that time, you consider your options, and if you need to make modifications, clarifications. And obviously, if it's a 4.5-foot fence, then you don't need us, by and large.
Yeah.
Those are your options. And of course, if you go forward, get the 5-foot waiver, for this particular fence design, as a sort of shrunk down version, reducing, 12 inches at various points.
Yeah.
That's another application. I mean, that's a permit that you're largely not, I wouldn't say stuck with, but it is the permit.
Sure.
You couldn't then radically redesign a fence and use that permit for that.
But that can be granted right now, that's something,
Well, we would decide on it and then issue a written decision.
okay.
Yeah, so you're
But
probably,
at this juncture, so I don't have to come back and with a 10%.
Right, you wouldn't, no, you
Okay.
wouldn't have to come back ever again.
I have a question.
Okay.
Is this property in the floodplain?
It is not in the floodplain. It is outside of, it's in the historic district, which it wasn't in 2017. It was re-district.
It's
Right.
in the historic district, but not the design review district.
So I,
Yes, that's
thinking
it.
creatively, and I guess going back to a kind of a question that I'd thrown out there about how do you measure the height of a fence?
Right,
It is,
so,
yeah.
I
Well,
don't think it actually says
it-
in 3101, so I think
Yeah.
I would go with the height, provision at 3002H, which generally they're talking about, measuring height from, yeah, it actually says structure, so, height shall be measured as the vertical distance from the highest point of the structure to the average of the highest and lowest points, and it says where the exterior wall meets the finished grade.
Yeah.
For the fence, I think you would just say where the fence meets the finished grade versus an exterior wall, because it's
So
all
if you
about
had a-
height of a structure, and
if-
a fence is a structure.
If you had a fence that was not resting on the ground, and the bottom of the fence was a foot above the ground,
I think,
Where
no,
would you-
because you
Well,
still
I
have
don't-
support posts.
I'm gonna cut this decision,
Okay.
I mean, this discussion a little off, only because we're liable to go into hypothetical land a little too deep.
True.
But I think Meredith points in a helpful direction with the 3002H, and, that's certainly a discussion that is probably best done in the specific, because there's all kinds of wild and crazy ideas that can spin.
You
Um,
can come
Gone
down to
through
the
a lot.
planning office.
But,
Yeah.
so I don't wanna necessarily go on record as a board to answer a question we haven't been asked in a formal way.
Fair enough.
So, that said, it's really in your court, how you want us to proceed.
I think it makes sense to get the waiver,
Okay,
no matter what. And if West and Allison decide to do the 4.5-foot fence, or lower than
The
almost
5.
5 feet,
yeah.
yeah, be careful, stay right under 5.
59.4.
59.1, yeah.
7:30 seconds or something.
It's something ridiculous.
Yeah. Then we'll go from there.
Your laser.
But-
Okay, so, does the board have any other questions about the waiver? I mean, I think there's been some compelling testimony as far as the criteria, and I'll just run through it for the purposes of the hearing. The variance of authorized shall not alter the essential character of the neighborhood or district in which the property is located. What,
We're doing waiver, right?
waiver,
Okay,
yeah.
sorry, you just said variance.
Sorry, I keep saying both of those things wrong. Actually, you know what it says? It's because it says the variance right here on the piece of paper in front of me. The waiver, if authorized, shall not alter the essential character of the neighborhood or district in which the property is located. I think we can all agree that this is not going to change the residential / slightly commercial mixed-use neighborhood by putting up a slightly higher fence. Substantially or permanently impair the lawful use or development of the adjacent property. This fence lies along the right-of-way. There's really, this isn't gonna affect the Meadow Mart's ability to use their property. And the other portions of the fence really touch the public right-of-way, which the Department of Public Works says they have no objections or issues with. Reduce access to renewable energy resources. This isn't going to affect the installation of solar panels on the house if they so desire, or a wind turbine.
And I'd like to acknowledge that more passively, this still allows for solar gain through
Mhm.
the windows that are constructed, which is another type of renewable energy for warmth.
Or be detrimental to the public welfare. Again, this doesn't seem that we have any type of issue with that. And then the other criteria being, the proposed land development is beneficial or necessary for the continued reasonable use of the property. I think there's been, an excessive amount of testimony showing that this will be beneficial to the property. It's an improvement. It does remove an invasive hedge and replace it with something that's more permanent sightly, and perhaps easier to maintain over the long run.
It's true.
Does that make sense for everyone? So, I will entertain a motion.
Considering all those factors, I will make a motion that we approve a 10% waiver of the 4.5-foot maximum height requirement for the front yard at 260 Elm Street along the Elm Street Road frontage for the fence design as proposed in the application.
Motion by Ryan. Do I have a second?
Second that.
Second by Rob.
Just a quick question,
Sure.
Discussion?
discussion. Do we need to include the DPW, spacing about, request about plantings along Elm and Vine Street, or is that just incorporated as?
I think they
Well-
were suggesting that they just, it's kind of a word of caution to the applicant to
Okay.
ensure that snow, and as the plantings themselves are not,
Versus- But not need to put it as a condition?
I don't
Okay,
think
just
so,
making
no.
sure.
Yep, but thank you.
Okay, perfect, thank
Yeah,
you.
I think that's right. It's a finding. Okay, any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of the motion, please raise your right hand. All right, you have your waiver.
10%.
Great.
Sorry,
Um,
sorry we couldn't go further.
No,
So-
you're not. It's fine.
I am
I'm
sorry. I
kidding.
wish I do. I mean, I think you made some compelling points. That
No,
it would
it
have
was
been.
good.
I would have at least liked to have been able to debate in more detail with Kate about and consider more fully, but I just don't think we have.
You have to retire to the 3 penny for that
Yeah.
policy discussion. All right, well, there'll be a written decision issued in the next, depending on Meredith's schedule,
As soon as I can.
as soon
Great,
as she can,
thanks.
so.
Thank
that's
you all
all.
for taking the time. I know that, you know,
you.
this is
Thank
a
you,
lot
Sarah.
of work, and I appreciate it.
It's a lot of work for you
Yeah,
too.
Yeah,
Yep.
thanks for.
it's a good fight.
thoughtful.
It's good.
All right, our other business, next meeting is Monday, October 7th, 2000.
I was just gonna say, for anybody listening, it's 3 weeks from now, not 2 weeks.
Right. Because we have that final week in September. So our next meeting is October 7th, 2019, 7 PM. That's a Monday. Any other business? Hearing none, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
I motion to adjourn.
Motion by Rob. Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Second by Claire. I knew we would get it. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. We are adjourned. Thank you very much.